Hi guys, this is a revision session for the poem Remains by Simon Armitage. So just before we start to look at the poem in a little bit more detail, here is some general advice just to help you revise whilst you are at home. So remember, don't focus on what you can't do. Remember, you're not expected to teach yourself new material. That is what your teachers in the classroom are for. So if you come across anything that you don't understand, make a note of it and speak to your subject teacher whilst you are at school. Remember to use this time wisely to revise and prepare revision materials. These will be incredibly useful to you throughout Year 11. Remember that you only have 1 hour of English per day, so set yourself 1 or 2 tasks that you want to do and achieve them. And whilst you are revising, try to vary your activities. You might decide to just do online tasks, do Seneca or Sam Learning one day, and then try some written work the next day by making revision materials. So there are various parts within the shared area that can aid your revision whilst you're at home. For example, if you go into the Pedmore shared area, there are some interesting revision materials underneath the Year 10 and 11 home learning tabs. There's also tasks set on Sam Learning and also on Seneca Learning, which you've been given your access code previously for. Remember, when you're revisiting prior learning, especially when you're looking at the poems, remember to reread them and select 3 quotations from each poem. You can then create revision cards for these and learn them. You can make notes on how each of the 15 poems can be linked together and why. Remember, in the exam you'll be given 1 poem in its entirety, so you won't need to remember the quotes, but you will be asked how you can compare them thematically with one of the poems from this anthology of your choice. It is really important that you understand each of the poems. BBC Bite Size is a really good start if you don't have your anthology with you and all the poems are listed. Remember to choose 1 poem to focus on at a time and make sure you're able to do the following. Briefly explain what the poem is about, link the poems to different themes and ideas, choose, annotate and learn 3 quotations, creating them into revision cards, and to challenge yourself a little bit further, you may want to explore wider reading and contextual information. There are new resources in the home learning folder to help you. Okay then, so let's have a look at the poem Remains in a little bit more detail. So who is Simon Armitage and why did he write this poem? Okay, so Armitage is an English poet, playwright and novelist. Remains has been taken from his 2008 collection The Not Dead, which looks at the effect of war on ex-soldiers. It is based on the account of a British soldier who served in Iraq. So we're going to have a read through the poem now in its entirety. Whilst you are listening to the reading of the poem, I suggest that you first and foremost think about what the poem is about. And as we read through, you start to make notes on interesting phrases that stand out to you or any techniques that particularly stand out. Remains by Simon Armitage. On another occasion, we got sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank, and one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not, while myself and somebody else are all of the same mind. So all 3 of us open fire, 3 of a kind that's all letting fly, and I swear I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So we've hit this looter a dozen times, and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. Pain itself, the image of agony. One of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body. Then he's carted off in the back of a lorry. End of story, except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street, and out on patrol I walk right over it week after week. Then I'm home on leave. But I blink, and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep, and he's probably armed and possibly not. Dream, and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds, and the drink and drugs won't flush him out. She's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead in some distant sand-smothered land, or 6 feet under in desert sand, but near to the knuckle here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands. So it's really important that you know what the poem is about. So the poem itself is about a group of soldiers who shoot a man who is running away from a bank raid. His death is described in graphic detail in the poem. The soldier telling the story isn't sure whether the man was armed or not, and this is something that he's playing on his mind. He can't get the image of the man's death out of his head. He's haunted by it. Knowing what the poem is about makes it really easy to think about the key themes that have been conveyed within Remains. We've obviously got the effects of conflict. We can also see that individual experiences are conveyed in the poem along with memory. Therefore, you could compare the importance of memory in this poem with poems such as Kamikaze. Poppy's Bayonet Charge and War Photographer all explore individual experiences of war and the effects of conflict. It is really important that you know the themes that each poem conveys, as you will be asked to compare 2 poems thematically during your exam. So let's have a look at the form, structure and language in the poem, starting with its form. As you can see, there's no regular line length or rhyme scheme, making it sound like somebody telling a story. The speaker starts with the first person plural we, which obviously conveys that this is a shared experience by all of the soldiers, and also stops the soldier from admitting any type of guilt. However, it quickly changes to the first person singular I, and the poem then becomes more personal, sounding almost like a confession. In the final couplet, both lines have the same meter, and this gives feeling of finality, and it hints that the guilt will stay with the soldier forever. In terms of the structure, the poem begins as if it's going to be an amusing anecdote. On another occasion, we got sent out. It's almost like storytelling, like the soldier is telling the story to his mates. However, it quickly turns into a graphic description of the man's death. This means there is a clear volta, or what we call a turning point, at the beginning of the 5th stanza, where the soldier's tone, thoughts and emotions are changed by his guilt. In terms of the language, we get a lot of graphic imagery. The man's death is described in gory detail. We can see broad daylight on the other side. We can see the bullets ripping through his body. And we can see the aftermath of those actions where his body's sort of on the ground, sort of inside out. And his guts are tossed back into his body. So the image of the death is quite gory and quite graphic in the imagery, with the implication that his guts are spilt out onto the ground. The imagery here reminds the readers of the horrors of war, but it also shows how desensitized these soldiers have become to violence. It had almost become a part of everyday life to them. The soldier also uses colloquial language. The first 4 stanzas have lots of chatty, familiar language, owing itself to its conversational style. Again, it clearly begins like it's going to be an amusing anecdote, like he's telling his mate a story. However, this language also goes away to trivializing the man's death. So things like sort of inside out, his guts were tossed back into his body, almost trivializes this man's death, makes it seem less than it is. Then we get this feeling of nonchalance. So initially, this is a very casual attitude towards the death of the man, and it links to the tone at the start being anecdotal. Again, this man is shot without warning, and his body is just thrown into a lorry and carted off, which would again suggest the feeling of nonchalance in the poem. However, after the Volta, we get this change. We get this feeling of guilt. The speaker can't get the memory of the killing out of his mind. He's bursting through the doors of the bank even in his sleep. Even when he closes his eyes, he sees the death of the man. He's tormented by the thoughts of the man, and also tormented by the fact that he will never know whether the man was armed or not. The poem ends with the speaker acknowledging that there is blood on his hands. He knows he's guilty. He knows that his bloody life was in his bloody hands. So we're now going to have a look at the poem stanza by stanza, starting with stanza 1. So as mentioned before, we start on a really conversational, chatty tone with the anecdote on another occasion. So here we sort of get the sense that this is going to be told like a story or an amusing anecdote. That is also backed up by the colloquial language that is used. So we've got the colloquial expression legs it. And again, this makes it sound like an ordinary anecdote, not the story it eventually leads to be. The stanza ends with the haunting line, probably armed, possibly not. The adverbs here in probably and possibly suggest doubt, which contrasts strongly with the definite action that follows in the second stanza. The second stanza starts with the line, well, myself and somebody else and somebody else. This here shows that it wasn't just the soldier alone that took this action, and perhaps that he's trying to shirk some sense of responsibility onto others. Again, this is highlighted with the use of the word all. And then all three of us in the next line down. So the repetition of this phrase sounds like he's keen for the reader to know it wasn't just him. And this again hints to us that he feels guilty. Again, he's trying to shirk some of that responsibility off onto others. Perhaps for his own peace of mind. We then get the soldiers opening fire. This comes as a surprise to us as the reader, as this sudden violence doesn't fit with the casual tone. We think it's going to start out as a light-hearted story, and then in the second stanza it becomes quite heavy. We get this violent imagery start to make its way into the poem. And then we get our first admission of guilt, the first use of the personal pronoun I. This is where the poetic voice switches. It now becomes more personal. It's a more personal account of the event. Again, this is repeated with the I see, I see. So the repeated phrase I see emphasizes the visual horror of seeing what he can see through his own eyes, but the fact that he is giving us some admission of guilt. He is responsible. And in stanza 3, we start to get some quite violent imagery come through, some quite graphic imagery. So we've got I see every round as it rips through his life. This is quite a violent metaphor. And again, it's contrasting quite shockingly with the colloquial, chatty, informal style in the first two stanzas. This is again emphasised by the phrase, I see broad daylight on the other side. Again, this is quite a grotesque, exaggerated image. He says he can see straight through the bullet holes in the man's body, again leaving us as a reader with a description of this man's death in gory detail. And then the stanza ends with the image of this dead man lying on the ground with his body sort of inside out. Again, this is quite a childish description of the man's body. And there's two ways of looking at this. So it is either that the man is quite dismissive or quite blasé about what he has just done. However, it could also be interpreted as the fact that the soldier is quite childish, and the speaker may be unable to process, using his vocabulary, what he can see before him in an adult way. He is struggling to process the events that have happened. In the fourth stanza then, we have some more casual colloquial language which would also make the feeling seem quite nonchalant. So we've got one of my mates goes by. So again, quite chatty and informal. And then we've got how the body is treated after this man's death, and tosses his guts back into his body. Then he's carted back off in a lorry. Again, these are two very casual and cold actions. It's showing that they're showing no respect for this dead man. The verbs tosses and carted make it sound as if the body is a piece of rubbish, not something to be treated with respect, which again adds to the nonchalant tone of the poem. Stanza 5 is where we start to see this turning point, this volta, this change in the speaker's tone and mood. So we start to get some admissions of guilt here, some real guilt. And we get this image that the speaker cannot get the memory of the killing out of his mind. The first line, end of story, except not really. It's a visual reminder of the death. It links to the fact that his blood shadow stays on the street. So again, we've got the word shadow and the fact that it's following him around like a shadow. But it also foreshadows the memories that are going to haunt him, are going to stay with him. On the last line of stanza 5, we've got a short, simple sentence in the phrase, then I am home on leave. He thinks that once he's home, he'll forget the terrible things he's seen. However, the suddenness of the line also hints at the speaker being confused. The stanza then ends with, but I blink, and the ending reflects the action of blinking, and the enjambment carries you forward as a reader, knowing that the horror is still there when the next stanza starts. In stanza 6 then, we've got these words related to sleep and dream. Sleeping and dreaming are often very peaceful actions, but we know here that he cannot rest, he's not in peace. And the short words, which are separated from the rest of the line, sound like gunshots, sleep, dream. So these supposedly peaceful events in life, he's being haunted in them. He can't sleep, he can't dream peacefully, he is haunted. And then we've got a little bit of repetition here of probably armed and possibly not, which we first see at the end of stanza 1. The repetition of this phrase shows us that he's replaying the event in his mind. It emphasises his inner turmoil. He's struggling with the fact that, again, he will never know whether or not this man was armed. And moving quickly on to stanza 7. We've got the metaphor of the dead man being dug in behind enemy lines. So this metaphor is comparing the memory that's stuck in the soldier's mind to the memory of him being stuck in the trenches. And again, we've got some violent imagery, again repeated, not left for dead, in some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land. So the violent parts of the compound adjective, stunned and smothered, show how place is affected by war. The long line and the sibilants slow the pace, so they reflect the speaker's lack of clear thought and the clarity that he's struggling to find. The end of the poem ends in a shorter stanza. Again, the two lines. We've got the end line, which is really poignant. His bloody life in my bloody hands. The word bloody being repeated twice could have a double meaning. So he's talking about the man's blood, which has been left on his hands that he can't wash off. But he also might be swearing in anger. And again, we've got the use of the word my. It is personal, there's no collective responsibility at all now. He feels completely responsible. Looking at the line on a whole, so his bloody life in my bloody hands could be a possible reference here to Macbeth. After persuading her husband to kill King Duncan, Lady Macbeth sleepwalks and tries to wash imaginary blood from her hands, where the famous quote from the poem "Out damn spot" comes from. This is what we call an illusion. So this illusion hints that the speaker has been unbalanced by his guilt, just like Lady Macbeth was in the play Macbeth. Okay, now that we've gotten to know the poem in some detail, we've looked at the language, form and structure of the poem, there are some things that you can do at home to further your revision and understanding of the poem. So, some suggested revision tasks for the poem remain. Summarise what the poem is about in 4 sentences. That's a very important thing for the exam. You must know what the poem is about. You can then move on to making annotations of the poem. You may have already done this in the classroom with your teacher. However, it is important that you go over the poem, maybe printing off a copy of the poem and seeing what you can remember from your initial study. Then you can have a look at selecting 3 or 4 quotations which you may like the look of, or which represent or convey particular themes presented in the poem. You can then explode them. Remember, when you're exploding a quotation, you must explore multiple connotations of individual words and identify any obvious techniques such as metaphors, similes, powerful verbs. Then you can move on to looking at the poem's form. How does it appear on the page? Looking at structure. How does the writer organise the idea or the order of ideas within the poem? A hint, a good way to do this is looking at the stanza length and the final couplet, as well as the conversational style, which includes things like colloquialisms and informal language. really important part of your exam is linking your themes back to contextual knowledge. So doing some contextual research is really important. You may want to find out about more of Armitage's work. As mentioned earlier, this poem is taken from an anthology called The Not Dead. What could this mean? Explore the title. You may also want to explore PTSD and its effects on soldiers. You can start with the British Library website and the resources in your home learning folder. The final part, which is a really important part of your revision, is being able to make links. So you want to start to think about how and why this poem can be linked to any of the other power and conflict poems. How can you link them thematically? Remember that all of these poems are linked by the theme of power and conflict. However, you must be more specific in the links that you are making. For example, this poem clearly shows conflict, and in particular, how this affects one person. So which other poems could also contain this idea? There is also an exam question that you may also want to answer. Again, this PowerPoint and all of the resources related to this PowerPoint can be found in the home learning folder. So, a reminder of the set tasks before I leave you to your own revision. Remember, you have all of this information in the Year 10 and 11 home learning folder on the Pedmore shared area. If you have any questions about further revision, please do come and speak to us as a department. We'll be happy to help. Any questions and support, obviously, as I've just previously said, feel free to email myself at any time. Send me any pictures of your revision resources or show me in the classroom. I hope you've enjoyed watching and listening to this revision resource for Remains by Simon Armitage. Happy revising.